Welcome everybody to the Advocacy Council. Today on the agenda is to discuss the December 5th Commission meeting, in which we will be discussing the equation of our past or our future. And it really does come down to a simple equation. If we want to have a resilient city, an affordable city, or do we want to clasp and grasp onto mid-century 1950s, 1960s buildings that really don't suit our needs. I've asked for the Millennial Council to participate in all of these discussions, being that the future of Miami Beach is something that has to be catered to their needs and their wants and their vision as well. And I thank you guys for joining us. And just one more minute, and then before I open it up for discussion, is that as of today, FEMA regulates our insurance premiums. They don't care if your building is historic or not. In fact, they clearly state they don't care. You have to meet certain base flood elevation standards. In order to meet those standards, your property has to be at a certain height. Miami Beach, as you know, when it was built, the highest level area of Miami Beach is Collins Avenue. And as you go west, it becomes lower and lower. And that's where our problem exists. So we have to decide if we're going to create and rebuild this beach to be resilient, to match the city's interests. The city has been spending over $400 million in infrastructure to raise our city. The mantra and the slogan of the city is now Miami Beach rising above. I believe that the property owners, residents, and the business owners have to rise to that occasion as well. Welcome, Ronaldo, just joined us. Would you like to chime in for a moment before we open up the discussion?
Well, absolutely. Okay. Great turnout for this conversation. So yeah, so I think that the challenge here is really what is that future for North Beach, and I think the conversation today will be about looking beyond, the challenge of preservation and what does that mean to the community. So I've got all my research here to share with all of you, but I hope I could make a presentation at Commission about sort of the architect's perspective on this issue.
Susie Toriente is putting the agenda together. She's in the UK at a conference, but I did forward your letter to her with a recommendation that be included. Okay. So I don't have confirmation, but I'm working towards it.
You sent a couple of really interesting articles. A little long one was like 519 pages. It was like
I printed in case you want.
I started reading. I got to about page 200 and something.
But no, I mean, and the idea there are other coastal communities that are facing the same question.
North Carolina and Boston.
How do you deal with historic assets and permanent flooding and the damage that brings to those assets? And the difficulty is that in most cases the historic assets need to be replaced. And that's sort of the sad truth that everybody's looking at it, from Annapolis to all the other coastal cities throughout the country.
And that was the point that the takeaway that I got from the articles you sent was there is going to be retreat. So it's either planned retreat or not. And if you want to save buildings, you can only forestall the inevitable, but the wisdom was, if there is a location to relocate the building to, if you really want to save it, then take the best you can opportunity to relocate it inland. And we know in Miami Beach that's not, there's no land that's safe because it's all the water's gonna come from everywhere. So in our case, that's not really a practical solution. We're gonna move it to Hialeah, it's just as bad. So there's nothing we can do about moving the property. And so it really leaves us the other alternative, which is unfortunately at some point these structures and all of Miami Beach has got problems if we don't raise the city.
Well, we're kind of at that point already. the discussion in the end of 2012 was, this is what's gonna happen. So now at the end of 2016, the insurance companies, the NFIP, increased the cap for flood insurance from $250,000 to $500,000. The insurance premiums have gone up 600%. The banks are saying, well, wait a second. This property has a higher value. I want additional flood insurance on the property.
Have they already started to say that?
They're starting to. There are houses on Alton Road that I've already been told that your house doesn't meet FEMA requirements, and therefore you have to build vents underneath your house. You cannot do that with a 1950s building in North Beach because they're concrete on slab. Now, if anybody would have taken the time to see the construction in the convention center, would have seen how fragile the concrete is, and the rebarb was falling apart. So if by chance of raising a building that people are talking about, it's a theoretical that is fantasy. Because in order to raise a concrete slab, you'd have to you have to dig underneath it, put hydraulics every 2 feet, then have a crane lift it. Which street exactly on Harding or on Collins are those cranes gonna sit? There's a 5-foot setback between the next door neighbor. How is it gonna pull out the building? How is it gonna be lifted out? And nobody will warranty that after spending this fortune of money, that it will actually work.
No, the warranty the opposite, it won't work.
Yeah.
Well, there's another whole practical side of that question too, is assume you spent the money and assume the building didn't collapse and you raised the building. As your term is, it doesn't pencil out anyway, because now you still have just a taller building with 2 families living in it. You can't raise the rent enough to cover the cost of what you just did, let alone actually make any money on it. So there's no logic to doing it, even if it would survive the lift.
And what added value did we bring to Miami Beach by doing this? Instead of opening up Miami Beach as a canvas for creative architects, like it once was, and saying, wait a second, here's an opportunity to build resilient, sustainable, bring Miami Beach, create a new language of what is Miami Beach modern, and open it up and bring the best in the world from our local talent and international talent to Miami Beach and open it up, as opposed to saying, let's close the envelope.
So strategically and politically, because I hear you, right? But the affordable housing argument, the argument about the homeowners who've owned their homes for how many years, this is their nest egg, and all of a sudden we're gonna say, your nest egg isn't gonna be worth anything, right? So I know we have to make these points, but I'm also looking at what's resonating and you know, how we're gonna get that message around. So as we talk about the different points to be made, right? And I happened to catch the video of the special commission meeting where you talked about affordable housing. And the city owned the 3 lots, 2 lots which have buildings from the 1950s, and the discussion about, in order to maximize that space, you have to be denser, which means you have to tear down those buildings which are already below the FEMA guidelines. And Commissioner Malakoff said, agree with her completely, doesn't make any sense to spend the money to restore those buildings when we should, looking at sea level rise, we should demolish them. There wasn't anybody in the audience, right? I mean, so I think it was a very honest, open conversation. The question is, if it's okay for city-owned properties and we're looking at it that way, why then do private property owners not have the same rights, okay, to protect their properties or be safe from, you know, from the sea level rise?
No, I absolutely, and that's why I asked for that to be added to the special agenda, and it was granted. Was it's actually the housing authority that owns those lots, and there's two opportunities there for either affordable or workforce housing. One of them is within what is, you know, targeted for local designation, and that's the one where it's an empty lot and then 2 one-story buildings. But it is in the lowest elevation in the city, and so if that becomes designated, you know, even if the commissioners, we think that it makes sense to take down those 1 stories. Once it's designated, that's a decision for the Historic Preservation Board. And if they don't agree, then the city is deprived of that housing opportunity. And the housing authority has to go compete for the project funding. And, you know, it's relevant how many units they can deliver in terms of their award, right?
They're more likely to get funding the more units they can deliver.
And they don't want,
Right.
and you're not gonna get funding to replace a 12-unit building with a 12-unit building because
Makes no
it
sense.
just makes no sense. But I do wanna correct something, that it's not about people's private homes here. We're talking about North Beach specifically on the agenda, which is multifamily buildings. And while the city decided that all the 1950s buildings, private homes, will not be on the National Register or are earmarked for preservation, which are 1,850 of them in North Beach, they were only concentrating on the multifamily area.
The private homes will not be designated?
Well,
No.
no,
No.
you mean single-family homes, because
Single family, right.
some of these multifamily, it is someone's private home.
Right,
They
right.
do live there,
They
they
have
may be
duplex or,
homesteaded.
yeah,
Okay.
but
You
it's
mean
very,
single
very,
family.
very few of them.
Single-family
There are very
homes,
few of them.
Okay.
So in Biscayne Point, Normandy Isle, all of those private homes are not in this discussion area.
Okay, so it's all multifamily.
It's predominantly multifamily. Some people have condos in some of those buildings,
Right,
but it's normally, it's pretty much multifamily.
okay.
Politically, I don't believe that my colleagues have the political will to walk away from local historic districts in North Beach altogether. I believe what there's still room for discussion about, and that's what December 5th will focus on, is the segments on the waterway where the planning department, the city staff, had a different judgment than the Historic Preservation Board. Planning department did a detailed analysis of those sections along the Tatum Waterway and along Marseille Drive, and determined that there weren't, you know, for a number of reasons, the elevation, the proximity to the water, the number of significant structures, that there wasn't enough there.
Well, there aren't any. They're
There's,
all,
I think,
no, there's not
Debbie
one
Tackett, I
there's-
walked it,
Yeah.
on foot, which I wish
Yeah.
everyone who has to vote, you know, would do if they can. I walked it on foot with Debbie Tackett and looked at every single structure. I've been back there and driven it 3 times more, you know, to keep myself anchored in those parts. But just so to level set for everyone, I think that's really all, for those that don't think that historic designation is the right route, I believe their only sort of hopeful opportunity are the areas along the waterfront. I don't think that there's the political appetite to not designate. And it's interesting because the conservation district, which I don't remember if it was at that special meeting or at the other meeting,
another-
we discussed it at land use, and I at least got some agreement there that the concept of a conservation district, which can afford you protections on height, massing, architectural style, basically the personality of the neighborhood can be preserved, but allowed to be redeveloped to be resilient through this concept of a conservation district. And the as of right build height there is, I think, 5 stories, 50 feet.
Yeah.
There is very little built to that scale. There's no 3 and 4 story buildings within the sections that I'm referring to, that are the ones that planning and HPB had a different opinion. They're primarily 2-story buildings. So there is, if you were allowed to rebuild new according to a conservation district style guide, if you will, you know, you'd be able to build up to 5 feet, and hopefully the economics of that would make it worthwhile. I really fear that, and that's why I'm here to listen to you all and to get educated by your perspective, is that if the economics don't work, then preservation is gonna fail, right?
So- Well,
Because
Can I
you'll just have decay.
educate everybody here? First of all, when we talk about protection, and I'm talking to the millennials sitting here in the room, That narrative in Miami Beach means protect us homeowners from the developer to build a larger structure. The second thing is historic preservation. If you're going to preserve a building, a property, you can get certain variances if you prove a hardship, or you cannot be preserved if you can prove a hardship. I don't understand why sea level rise in the first place isn't enough of a hardship not to be preserved in this day and time. If we're still arguing whether sea level rise is real or not, that's one thing, but the city has already committed over $400 million to becoming resilient. So I would think that we're after that discussion. So
So
historic
wait, does that
preservation.
become a legal question, Wayne? If someone went to you as a land use attorney and said, listen, they're gonna designate this property of mine and I won't be able to take it down, but I believe that sea level rise is a condemning factor and it should be a hardship. I mean, how can you say that the water's not gonna destroy my building? Would that be a plausible argument to say, I shouldn't be designated historic because I have to be allowed to raise my building, knock it down and build a larger building because
I wanna knock it down.
rising tide is a hardship?
Well, I think it's already an issue. I did the project, the Palau project on Sunset and 20th, and when I was making my presentation before the board, I asked that they allow us to raise our building, our base flood elevation 3 feet, which we still would have been under the permitted height envelope of 150 feet. We would have been at 149 because we were at 146. And we had a number of neighbors across the way that were saying, no, don't allow them to do that. And the board's position was, since they gave us everything else, that they were going to hold us back. And I tried to explain to them that it's a very bad idea. I said, one, it will not affect their aesthetic view corridors from the neighborhood to the north. And we had, facts and documents and demonstration to show them that was the case. And then in addition to that, I said, eventually the city's going to have to do something with all the flooding here, like raise the roads. Well, during about halfway through the construction, the city comes and raises the roads. So now you have the situation where the building should have been like this and the road like this, and now it's the opposite. So now when we have not even king tide, but flooding, some of the retail down below, the stores front, if some of you drove by there a month or two ago, you would have seen the flood panels up, those aluminum flood panels. They were up before king tide season. So yes, it's gonna spur litigation at some point if people feel that, hey, you're not allowing me to build a project that's sustainable, that will last, and allow me to, get financing or my investment and so on.
Or allow me to build the height
Yes.
measured correctly
What's it-
when you're in fact changing the measurement on me.
So does Historic Preservation Board have a quantifiable formula of what is a hardship?
So can I ask one
That's
question?
to
Because
Wayne, to
conservation
Wayne.
districts, will get us out of HPB and into planning board, right?
Into DRB.
Okay.
Design Review Board.
Okay.
And the other thing about the importance of, if we're going to go the local historic designation route, it's really important to get that right, because that can only be undone through a voter referendum.
Right.
So that can only be undone at the polls. So if we're wrong, it's gonna be really hard to get back on track, and that's a concern.
Yeah, so in the question of are we wrong, in terms of looking at that future and governing the city towards this future that we know is happening, I find it to be unbelievable that, we're kind of questioning the reality of what's gonna happen to this barrier island. I mean, we're projecting, and Susie will confirm, about 81 inches in 100 years, so if you project that through time, in 25 years' time, which is right around the corner, you may have, close to 20 inches of increased permanent, water in this community. We already see what happens during the king tide now and what you saw along the canal today. I mean, just imagine 20 more inches of that in the community. Imagine 40 more inches of that. So the concern and the research that I've been doing is that the struggle that all historic districts, including St. Augustine, the oldest city that we have in this country, is sort of facing that fragile nature of these buildings and what happens with permanent flooding, what happens to real estate valuation, what happens to the viability of the entire neighborhood, for the landowners, for the real stakeholders. This RM1 district is unique in the sense that most of it is really a rental community, right? So the landowners will be severely injured you know, and I'm an architect, not an attorney, so I'm using kind of like a legal term.
And I'm an attorney, not an architect.
There you go.
Make a good
So,
team.
so, you know, I think through time, you know, somebody's gonna come back and say, the commission, knowing what they knew then, how could you designate, you know, an entire neighborhood like this, knowing what you know, will be
Right.
the impact, the physical impact to these buildings, and to the fact that nobody's gonna be able to insure these assets. Renovating them is not gonna be a long-term solution, you know, because the buildings are very fragile. I mean, I have done, so far in the last 24 years, probably close to $1 billion of renovation of existing buildings. That's the Royal Palm, the Canyon Ranch, you know, now I'm doing the Park Central on Ocean Drive. The question becomes, when do you stop thinking the same way that we've been thinking, you know, with these historic districts? And it's a difficult question, you know, because there's a lot of passion to save what is there now. It's such a beautiful community. I mean, nobody questions that the community is not appropriately scaled and that is beautiful. The question is, what is the life of that community in its future, and the way that it will be reevaluated in real estate terms for you know, reinforcing the resiliency strategy that the city has. So if the city says, we're already gonna raise the streets, there's already a strategy here to raise the streets, to raise the infrastructure. How can we not consider that issue when we think about designating an entire neighborhood historic, which basically will, in my opinion, will sort of limit the possibilities of really creating resiliency in the entire neighborhood. Big picture now. And one of the things that all these research documents say is that it becomes very difficult to govern these historic neighborhoods now because, you know, preservation is such a popular issue. I mean, preservation really has been one of the ways that we bring sustainability into futures of cities, because we give buildings a new life. And there's great logic in that, that when buildings learn and become something else, and we've got plenty of those examples around here, it's a great reinforcing aspect. You expand the life of the heritage, the architectural heritage of the city. These are all the things that are in contradiction now with the way that we look at North Beach and RM1 specifically, to focus on that. But to even consider that the whole neighborhood will be somehow protected by this designation, you know, it just, there's no logic, there's no way to defend that with rational thinking. You know, and that's where you get into the emotionality of this. And that's what becomes very difficult, that, you know, when you judge it based on emotions, on the look and the feel and the scale, and this is where I live and I want to be displaced. I mean, these are all very difficult issues for political leadership to deal with. And where I'm coming from as an architect is sort of like, look, let's think through this thing long term, okay? So to me, it's like bizarre, in a way, is the best word I could use, to think that we're gonna be preserving anything in this community that we know as the RM1 district in North Beach. I think that, you know, it's sort of punishment to those that own assets in that neighborhood, and that'll trickle down to the city, because the city will lose revenue that it desperately needs to adapt. I mean, because that's the big question, is how do we adapt, how do we increase revenue through taxable, you know, assets into the future of the city. So it kind of becomes a question of economics, viability, and the reality that really there's no preserving of anything there, because eventually it's going to be damaged. I mean, Mother Nature will take over, and if you look at 80 inches in 100 years, that is like detrimental.
Well, we don't have to look so far down the road, because if you look at what happened in the king tides and the high tides on Crespi Boulevard today, the water is already reaching the property line. When you wanted to, if you wanted to make a statement, a comment, and make a couple of comments, but then I want to ask the younger people that joined us from the Millennial Group, to ask questions and to give us your views and positions and what your perception is of what's going on here.
You know, I think you have to start with some premises that, you know, Miami Beach has long been a city that has looked at historic preservation, you know, very favorably, and it's been very positive over the years. But at the time that, you know, historic preservation really came into being here in Miami Beach, we didn't face king tides. You know, we didn't face, you know, climate change and sea level rise. Those are all major game changers, and you have to start thinking differently. The law will also change dramatically with this issue. Already there's been some test cases. What typically happens is, in different states, usually California is usually the first state, and then things kind of move east. But it happened in Illinois last year, where a major insurance company, I think it was Farmers, sued the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. Now, they didn't intend to win. They filed a test case. and they wanted to see how the courts reacted. And what they did was, the essence of the case was that they sued the government saying, you're not doing enough to provide a community that is safe from flooding, meaning homes and businesses and so on. And therefore, we are paying more money out to our insureds because the risk is higher. And what they were really looking for was, what was the court going to say is the obligation of government to do this. And some very interesting facts came out, although ultimately the case was dismissed, which was expected. There will be hundreds of these cases filed in the next 10 years. And Miami Beach will probably be one city that will also be sued by businesses or insurance companies, because, as Ronaldo was alluding to, we already know there's an issue. So now, how do you react to it, and what kind of risk do you take if you don't? You have, for instance, in Miami Beach, where at the end of 88th Street, where Renzi is doing that new building that was the former Holiday Inn. The building was torn down, but the city, on the other hand, is going to get over $15 million in its coffers for the betterment of the community by replacing it with a state-of-the-art building. Plus, you're going to get a building. I think this is his first building in Miami Beach. He's a world-renowned architect. So that also brings value. We have to evolve too in our architecture as well. Things that Ronaldo designs and a lot of these star architects and so on. But I think the thing that the city, and I can tell you, as the chairman of the City Miami Sea Level Rise Committee, and Ronaldo sits on that committee, we're taking a totally different approach than what Miami Beach is doing. We're telling the commission that you must take in consideration sea level rise before you make do capital improvements, before you approve major projects. That you have to consider this issue. And quite honestly, the people on the Historic Preservation Board don't get it. They have no knowledge. If you took a poll of any of them and said, how many of you have gone to courses? How many of you have gone to lectures? How many of you have actually been involved in understanding these issues from an architectural, legal side? And none of them would say yes. They're only voting from their heart or their passion for historic preservation. I'm not championing that we should tear down every old building, but I will tell you that if we don't start thinking differently, Miami Beach is going to be in real trouble a lot sooner. And why? The insurance companies and the banks are going to control this issue. And the insurance industry is just waiting to say, look, you're not doing enough. We won't finance things on Miami Beach. We won't provide insurance, or we'll cut back insurance. And that's going to trigger banks acting differently. Banks are going to start asking for excess flood insurance. They're also going to start saying we're not giving 30-year mortgages, or we're unwilling to insure in areas where you're not allowed to build buildings that will be resilient and sustainable for the future. That's already being considered by banks. I represent a number of banks in my law firm. We've had those conversations with them. It's just a matter of time when that's going to happen. And the historic property owners are going to be faced with something that they're not going to be able to afford. They won't be able to afford the insurance. I can tell you, I was in a conference the other day, and I spoke at the Wharton School a few weeks ago. And one of the things that was for sure that came out is that flood insurance in high-risk areas, and all of Miami Beach is the highest category with regards to flood insurance. It's a flood hazardous area, special flood hazardous area. So there's no retreat, as I think Jerry was mentioning. So insurance is going to change, and it's going to change here first because everybody's looking at Miami Beach. And if you know anything about what happened in 2012 and 2014, the Bigger Waters Act and the Affordability Act gave everybody a sigh of relief because they put back all of the subsidies for flood insurance. But Congress, especially under Trump, is probably going to take all the subsidies off again. And you're going to be back by what they were doing in 2012. So someone who owns a home that was paying $2,000 a year for flood insurance might go up to $30,000. Imagine what a commercial historic building in an area that floods will be in the future. It's going to change. The documents, the history, the history is already there. The Affordability Act is nothing more than the 2012 Bigger Waters Act in sheep's clothing because it has escalation clauses in it, which they've already exceeded for the first 5 years of the act. So you can talk about historic preservation, you can talk about resiliency. That's not what's driving the bus. It's going to be insurance. Insurance and banking will change Miami Beach on how you and where you're going to have your tax dollars to be able to implement infrastructure for the future. And it's not to say you should get rid of every historic district, but they're the ones that will be hit the hardest. And those property owners and people who live there will be hit the hardest. And that's coming. It's already written. It's already, pretty much an exact science out there. If you go to some of these national forums and you go to and meet some of the people, or even people from HUD or people from government, and I've been in those forums, they'll tell you it's not getting better. It's getting worse.
So if we have historic districts already, that's one thing. But to take an active measure to increase our historic zones that haven't flourished in the last 30, 40 years, that didn't have these restrictions on them. Now putting a restriction on them to think that that will make them flourish is just absurd. So let's hear from.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Sari.
I think someone's talking.
No, go ahead,
No?
sir.
Okay, so we have about 15 of us that are all tuned in right now, and I think what we want to know based on this meeting is to talk about the December 5th meeting and exactly what is the left side, what's the right side, and then a little snippet about each, because I know in a little bit, about 15 minutes, everyone has to leave.
Okay, so quickly, I will play the preservation and you'll play the progress.
Right, so look, Miami Beach is a blessed place in the sense that we have great design review process, okay? Outside of this community, I think probably San Francisco is another place where to approve a project, you really have to go through quite a process to make sure that the quality of the architecture and the urbanism is the best that it could possibly be. So here we have Design Review Board in the general area of the city, and then we have Historic Preservation Board in the designated area. So in this case, if RM1 in North Beach becomes designated, you would then have to go to the Historic Preservation Board to get your projects approved. My concern as an architect, of course, is that my friends in the Historic Preservation Boards have already said that they don't want to factor in sea level rise when they make their decisions. I mean, it's like, how could you preserve something without understanding the long-term effect that climate change is having in our city? I mean, it's irresponsible. So it gets my blood pumping. With a conservation district, you still have the protection of a design review board. You could still have design guidelines that we could really draft. Nobody has really done good design guidelines for these neighborhoods. We could do that, okay? There's a design solution for everything. That's why I'm so passionate about this, because everything we talk about in terms of insurability and all the damage that could come to these cities could be prevented if we design into it. So by allowing a conservation district to be in place and by rethinking some of the ways that we incentivize the redevelopment of these areas, because right now there's no incentive. I mean, the whole Dover Coal master plan, with all due respect, really had no incentive.
Zero.
You know, I mean, the TDR idea was a joke. I mean, if you really look at the math of the TDR strategy, it just makes no sense absolutely in the real world.
Explain, because you're talking to people who may not be aware.
So the TDR is
Well, don't explain it to the TDR because it's already off the table, so
Okay.
just go on that there aren't
Yeah,
any
so-
incentives.
What's the bill? Like, what's the bill? And then it's either in favor or not in favor.
So-
Okay,
Is
so
that-
here,
Yeah,
okay.
like just as basic as
Okay.
possible.
The commission will be voting on December 5th to instruct the planning department of Miami Beach to prepare a design document for preserving North Beach. The people that are for it believe that if there isn't controls and what they call protections from the Historic Preservation Board, then it will create unbridled development and create monsters all over Miami Beach. To that I say, why didn't that happen in the last 40 years? And the reason is because Miami Beach is very expensive. And the more we regulate how large or not, the inability to develop, the more expensive the product becomes. If we want our city to have an area that will be, let's not talk about affordable, attainable, a little above our reach, the only place to develop would be in North Beach. Now, in order to make it attainable, you have to put more apartments on that specific piece of land. That reduces the costs to the developer, and that costs get passed on to the buyer or the renter. It's very simple. This is not, you don't need a master's in economics to understand that if you allow a little more development, it'll allow a little more affordability. The total housing stock in Miami Beach in the last 20 years has gone down, supply and demand. So if there was 61,000 total homes, possible apartments and homes together in Miami Beach in 2000, there are only 51,000 today. Doesn't that create more expensive? So we have to say no to preservation, yes to incentives, yes to development responsibility, yes to allowing the commission to take a look at North Beach as an opportunity to welcome residents to live as opposed to pushing them away. Equality of housing, protection from sea level rise, it equals the same thing.
Are we
If I-
arguing for conservation?
If I may, because I think I can clarify what December 5th is really about. Because there's actually, I think, quite a lot of agreement. There's agreement that as a city, we want to revitalize North Beach and encourage investment. We're looking to have a vibrant town center and make it, and even more. It's already it's charming architecturally. It's a very family, sort of neighborhoody type feel, more low-key than South Beach, and yet somehow more urban than Mid Beach, which is all single-family homes. So it has a tremendous amount of potential. The preservation community is very concerned because there's a lot of charm in what they're calling MIMO architecture, which is sort of post-war Jetsons,
But no,
Miami
they're-
modern-looking
they're-
architecture, and the preservationists are concerned that as revitalization occurs, then there will be economic incentives to sort of demolish all of this special, unique architecture that you won't get back. And they're concerned about losing the structures themselves. So there's consensus for revitalization. There's consensus, I believe, up in North Beach about the basic scale, meaning no one of the residents that I talked to and the activists is looking for high rises, for example, to be built all up and down the Tatum Waterway. People don't want that. And so the preservation community is grasping onto that and saying, well, the only way we can really protect that is through local historic designation. Local historic designation protects the structures themselves the way they're built right now, because the Historic Preservation Board, or HPB, are the ones that have their finger on the decision of yes, property owner, you can, or no, you cannot demolish that structure that's there. So they want that power because, and the preservation community wants them to have it because there's a trust factor that the HPB over time has proven that they're very strong preservationists. There is another method by which the city can protect the height, to keep the height within whatever height of buildings we deem is appropriate, and right now that's 5 stories. To keep the architectural charm, if we could put together a design guide that would be part of the conservation district. And there's also something about building massing. These are 8, 12, 16 unit little buildings with gardens in between versus buildings that might take up all of a city block as one contiguous structure. So that's called massing, and massing can also be controlled. So the argument is about the method, and December 5th conversation is about the method. Do we want to do local historic designation and protect the structures themselves at the elevation they're at now, even though we know the city's going to come in and raise the road perhaps 3 feet, seawalls are going to go 6 feet higher, and on any empty lot, the starting first level finished floor is going to be at the tops of the windows of the historic building beside it. Is that what we want? Or do we want to say, let's have a conservation district recognizing the actual structures, we might lose them, but we definitely are committed to controlling the height, the design, and the massing. That's what we're arguing about, is which is the right method for the community.
That's a brilliant description of where we're at, and I just wonder if you have any sense, Commissioner, as to where you think the chips fall on that. We know some are totally one end of just has to be preservation at all costs.
I think that my colleagues, especially my colleagues, that have to run for re-election in 1 year, are under a tremendous amount of pressure from the preservation community. The preservation community is very vocal, they're very organized, they're experts at social media, and they wield that power, and they use that power to send their message. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but there's no counterbalancing organized voice or force that can let the commissioners know, hey, I got you, if you don't agree with that, I'm gonna back you up when it comes time to get reelected. So I think politically, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the commissioners to do exactly what the preservation activists ask them to do. It's gonna take a tremendous amount of leadership, individual leadership and guts on the part of my colleagues and I to do anything other than that.
So, I'll be just 1 second. So just to walk through for those of you that may not be aware, the process is that the meeting on December 5th is the opportunity for the commission to decide either to stop the process right now, and that takes 5 out of 7 of the commissioners to say stop. That means there will be no designation report, and therefore it stays the way it is now, and there's no more designation. If there are not 5 that say stop today, then a designation report will be created, and it will take somewhere between 6 months and a year for the planning department to create their report, after which it will go back to the Historic Preservation Board for their input, then to the planning board for their input, and then to the commission for final approval. At that second time it comes to the commission, in a year or so, it takes 5 votes of the commission to approve whatever comes up. If they only get 4 or 3, it dies, and they're right where they could be today with 5 votes against it. So we'll need 5 to approve it. It's quite possible that that designation report, if in fact it gets created and comes back to the commission, is after the election.
Well, here's the thing, let's not get too deep into the weeds.
Does it take 5 to designate whether it's
Well, let's-
historic or conservation?
It takes,
Well, no.
yes, it
Let's-
takes 5 to do anything at all.
Right now,
on this issue.
right now, it needs 5 commissioners to make an affirmative or negative vote to give direction to staff of Miami Beach. I believe we have the responsibility to make our position known that we want this commission to act on the air of climate change. We want them to act on the air of affordability, equality in housing. We have the largest equality gap in the country in Miami Beach. We can bridge that gap, and we have to find incentives how to meet those goals. Preservation doesn't answer any of those goals. If it would, we'd be all over it.
But
Wait,
what-
I'm sorry,
I just, I've done a few renovations. And I don't know if anybody's ever really looked at renovations and how you reserve in a historical design review board or a historical design preservation area. But most times that you renovate a property is because the life of the property, the physical condition, the wood in the property has rotted to a bad condition. This new concept called concrete restoration is where they draw, and you see this all up and down the big hotels sometimes, where they have these marks on the walls. That's where they've come in, and they've designated the rebar has disappeared as a result of the salt in the cement that was used in the 1940s because they used the cement off the beach. Forgetting all of that issue, eventually what happens is that they have to hold up the exterior walls while they redo all of the interior because the columns that hold up the interior have rotted away on the bottom and they have to be replaced. So when we renovate a historical design building, you get entirely new inside and you're left with the exterior walls. Now, the walls under concrete restoration have now been cut up, new steel's been put in, so they plaster over the walls. So in essence, you've got a complete new building. So when someone says
Yeah,
to
but
me,
it's
your
like-
concrete restoration, one moment, when you're talking to me about concrete restoration, you could have been much easier, much quicker, and much better if you built the exact building the way you wanted it to be built originally. That's unfortunately what I see. I've gone by buildings and you see how they have the steel out there. They've installed just to hold up to your exterior wall. But
I have a question for Albie and Reno, and anyone really. I'm gonna paraphrase to simplify what a couple of the preservationists have said to me, which is, you know, it's not my job to tell you how to save these buildings. It's my job to tell you that they're important, that they're significant historically. It's somebody else's job to figure out how to save them. And I'm wondering, you know, what you all would say to that.
Well, I think what he's describing is that, you know, the reality of bringing these buildings back to life and the method that he's describing doesn't really affect the way the building is meeting the street. The elevation of the building stays the same. So that building now will be damaged by permanent flooding eventually. So it's really a lot of energy and effort that goes into these restorations, a lot of money, a lot of risk.
But wait a minute, you forget one very important issue. The 1940 building code was a 1940 building code. Today, we have the 2016 building code. We have hurricane codes, life safety codes. You know, it's so interesting to note one thing, that if you build a building today, your stairwell has to be 48 inches. Life safety requires it. Now, take any of these buildings that you see here today, and I assure you, not one of their life safety, not one of their staircases is 48 inches wide. They have to get a special variance for that. And now, how do you sprinkle a building? Any multi-story building has to be sprinkled. How do you sprinkle fire sprinklers? How do you bring up the risers, which then go into the...
You're getting too technical. You're getting too technical.
No, all I'm trying to say is as follows.
Do you have a question?
If you want, and this is ultimately the real question over here, if you want a certain design, you have to do it by a conservative district. You have to say, I want modern deco, whatever you guys decide on, we can all agree upon that. But saving buildings that were built in 1940 and what we call wood balloon, which is the insides are all made of 2x4s, which have been rotted away by either water or by termite, and replace it, then I think we're all fooling ourselves when you look at the fact that you're dealing with a flood criteria. The other issue I give to you is as follows.
Wait, one second. I think we have a lot of people on the phone that want to ask some
I
questions.
say something as well?
Yes, so
You can.
So
our
Sarah,
first
you wanna-
question from a MAC member is, I'm wondering if there's a more favorable opinion on well-designed mixed-use development using historical features versus what the community may be expecting as a building boom of condominiums.
You want to field that one? Wayne, you want to field that one? Give Wayne a chance.
Wondering if there is a more favorable opinion on well-designed mixed-use development using historical features versus what the community may be expecting as a building boom of condominiums.
So you're talking about adaptive reuse and things like that? So it's not
Sounds
clear what they're
sounds like
Design guidelines. It's
to look like.
design
With the
guidelines.
same,
Buildings don't have the FAR to do it.
with the same
There's
style, with the same
there's a
style.
rule in Miami Beach that you can increase if you have the appropriate FAR by going one story up. So if you have a 3-story building, you can build a 4-story building. An example of that would be the Gale Hotel. If you go over to the Gale Hotel, you can see an example of that. The key to that is that if you stand at a certain location on the street, depending upon the view corridor, if you don't see the addition, you can build the addition. You have to step it back.
But very few
So
lots have that.
where you have this, what you've seen what's happening here is people have come in and they built, when they renovate this structure, they've taken and they've added, assuming they have the extra FAR, they've added that 4th floor or 3rd floor in a more modernistic view. So you have a mixture of both the Art Deco preservation and more of a modern look on top.
Okay, wait,
That's
they
one
just
use.
clarified. Question seems to be, can't we agree to develop something attractive, mixed use, and great for the community as opposed to the Brickell high-rise boom?
Okay, there is a very important distinction between Sunny Isles, Brickell, and Miami Beach. If anybody has taken a look at the master planner's consensus plan, they would see that there are a number of pictures that were asked in the survey. They showed the existing Crespi Tatum waterway of 1-story and 2-story buildings, and then they showed Brickell 60-story buildings as what do you like more. It was about a 50-50. Now, between 2-story and 60, there's a lot of compromise. So I say, my answer is yes.
Well, and to be specific, currently in this residential multifamily one, RM1 district that we're talking about, there's already a height limitation of 5 stories, 50 feet. That's already in place, and there's no variance process in Miami Beach, so you could only go 3 feet higher than that, basically.
So
that limitation is already in place. So any discussion about sunny aisles or brickle or high rises is inflammatory and not correct.
Yes.
Now, the RM1 district doesn't allow for mixed use. That's first. Second of all, and third of all, the current FAR, which means floor area ratio, that means the amount of apartments or actual livable space that you can build in this district won't even get you to the 5 stories.
Okay.
So there was a downzoning many years ago, and that's why we saw no development in North Beach. Well, where we did see that in South Beach and in other areas of the city.
Another question?
We have another question too.
No, but if you want to look at commercial, when you look at mixed use, not as a building, but as a community, and if we were talking about generating commercial uses on 71st Street or Collins Avenue,
It's a different discussion.
is a different discussion. But the key to those uses is a neighborhood. And a neighborhood requires people. And you have to generate the rooms, the apartments capable that people can live there as a home. We're in a total different society today. I didn't drive here, I Ubered here. And I live on Miami Beach, and I only raise that for the issue.
Ugly car when you pulled up.
Yeah, it was a great car. It was a great car. Why? Because I knew there was no parking because of Art Deco. But that's what we have there. We have an opportunity to generate a new North Beach, if we're just smart enough to do it.
Wayne, will you field the next question?
You got a
Sorry.
question?
All right, next question
Ask
is,
one of my own.
which of the current commissioners are opposing this issue, and where's the pushback coming from? Because not everyone from MAG is familiar with the commissioners.
Want me to answer?
And then,
I'll answer.
and also, why are the commissioners
I'll-
pushing back on
I won't push you on the point on that. Unless you-
Well,
go ahead.
most of those that are running for re-election are opposed, for the exact reasons that Commissioner Alleman said earlier, that there's a strong preservationist, community, and they're pushing for the historic preservation, and they're up for re-election. And then I think it's held close to the vest with some of the other commissioners as to which way they'll go, depending upon what they feel the majority will do. I think, pardon me, Jerry?
No, I was just gonna add that even if there are commissioners who do not support it, they know that it takes 5. So why are they gonna throw themselves off a cliff in a vote that they're gonna lose? Because unless there's 5 against it, they're not willing to stick their neck out. I would prefer that they would stick their neck out and say, this is what's in the best interest of the community. I think this is where we should be. And it goes however it goes, but you take a position.
I had sent a letter to.
I mean, it's
tough.
What Jerry just described was absolutely correct. I mean, for me it took me 2 commission meetings just to get the
discussion.
December 5th meeting scheduled. So, my neck is out there. I think it's okay, because although it's funny, because I live in a 1946 house that I've dumped a ton of money into preserving, but I'm a pragmatist, and I'm deeply concerned about, for these areas where the roads and the seawalls are going to end up, and adding a new set of restrictions to what has escaped any sort of investment or revitalization in decades. And now we're going to say, we're ready for resiliency, and we're ready for revitalization, but we're going to make it even harder than it's already been. I mean, it doesn't really make sense. But politically, my neck is out already. So there's 6 more: the mayor and the other 5.
There have been 2 vocal commissioners that have stated their position to be forceful in their position to preserve. And that is Commissioner Rosen Gonzalez and Commissioner Steinberg. Those 2 commissioners have said that they want to preserve. They believe, again, what Commissioner Alleman mentioned before. They believe the trust factor, that they will put the control into the HPB and they'll figure it out. Wayne?
But the political commercial, ready to go, is the town center vote, where all of the commissioners said, yes, we will trade preservation for town center. And you have a commissioner ready to tee up that video to run it.
Oh, she teed it up once already.
Exactly.
But
So
here's the thing,
how do we
that's why I
get
said,
there?
I don't
How do we
think
get
we're-
there?
I don't think we're talking on December 5th, as I said before, about throwing out the entire local historic. There is a significant, if you look in the master plan, I can't remember what page it is, but there's a map. And there's blue areas in the master plan that are targeted for local historic designation, and then there's yellow areas that are targeted for conservation district. I'm gonna have to say it again on the 5th. I do think that the conservation district, we might as well stretch that to the full boundaries, because that gives you the protection that I think we have consensus on. Height, scale, design, even though the guide isn't written yet, it will be, massing. The other map, hold on, what is up for discussion, I think, are the waterway areas. Okay, Miami Beach is higher along Collins on the east side. It's a
The ridge.
right.
On the ridge.
There's a ridge on Collins. So the Collins side, the east side is higher in elevation, and then it gets gradually lower in elevation as you go west. So what we're talking about now are the properties that are along the seawall, which are the lowest lying and adjacent to the water. So that's why I think if those were be allowed to redevelop under conservation district guidelines with the higher seawalls and the raised roads, you'd get a second ridge. And so the area in the middle that is still being targeted for local historic designation, you kind of buy them some time. You've protected those properties along the whole way, maybe somebody will come along with a great strategy for how to preserve these properties. I haven't heard anyone with one yet.
Well, we spent
But
$400,000.
you can buy some time
Right.
if
So-
you protect
So the
yourself from the
commissioner is
water.
proposing
That's my question. How we help.
is proposing a compromise. But I still want to get to your questions, and Wayne, first Wayne, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I have to leave. It's my anniversary. I know my wife wants me to show up. So, Commissioner Alleman, I have a question for you. I think you've been, since you've been elected, a very productive and open commissioner who's really considered a lot of issues that you probably, in your wildest dreams when you ran, never thought you'd be up there addressing and voting on. But, when you talk about master planning, historic preservation, it's not the way it used to be. There's someone else out there, it's called Mother Nature. She doesn't read zoning codes, and she doesn't read master plans. And if you go to some of these international, national forums that I've been to, I think, Ronaldo's been to some, so many other cities are doing great things. And we are ground zero, and we're not. And it's okay to say you raise a road, you put in a couple of pumps. That's not the solution for the future. And I would tell you that before you approve a master plan or a historic designation, not that historic designation is bad, the city should have spent a lot of money hiring professionals to tell them about what sea level rise, insurance, and other changes will cost this city if you go forward with plans that are devoid of being resilient and sustainable. And you're not doing that here. And you are going forward to potentially vote on something with, and you said it yourself, the historic preservationists just say, we just want you to restore it, preserve it, we don't care how you do it. That should tell you in of itself that they don't have the knowledge, the know-how, or have considered the consequences of what they are proposing. And the future of this city, this is not a city that is 50 square miles. It's a very small city. Whatever you do there will affect the entire city going forward, and property values, and future taxation. And I read the proposed master plan, and I was shocked that the city would accept something that does not consider all of the things that many other cities in the United States and around the world are considering before they build or redo a city or a section. You could take North Beach and make that the poster child of what to do if you want to. But you're cutting it up into little cookie, cutter type things. And I can tell you, as a
57-year resident of Miami Beach, it's a huge mistake. You're gonna change the direction of Miami Beach. On the Miami side, where I chair, that committee, we have told government, don't do that anymore. Stop following Miami 21. Miami 21 does not recognize how to build a city dealing with sea level rise and flooding. We are trying to have an impact over there so they don't make these mistakes. You have an opportunity now before you build, before you approve, to do the right thing. And you don't have the knowledge yet. You don't have the information, and none of the reports that I've seen do you have it. What you do have is you have some very knowledgeable people like Susie Torrente, who's a very good ACM and has a lot of knowledge about this, but let her do her job. Let her come back and actually tell you, this is really not the direction we should be going in. We should be doing things that are proactive. You're building a convention center, $600 million. Do you know how over budget it is already? You wouldn't want me to say it to everybody how over budget it is. It is not resilient. It's the biggest capital project in the city's history. And we approve something that is not resilient for the future. Just because it's 2.5 feet above sea level doesn't make it resilient. You don't make the same mistake in North Beach. Don't let it become a developer preservationist issue. It's more of a community issue of what do we build that's right for the future.
And that's a message to you guys. We have 2 more questions.
Yeah, first of all, a couple people said yes to Wayne's point, exclamation point. Okay.
On that note, you can go,
It's time
right?
to depart.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Let's see what the other 2 questions are.
Okay, so we have somebody that says, can some kind of advisory council, potentially from MAC, be formed to advise these particular commissioners, the opposing ones, in finding solutions that can mesh preservation and account for SLR? There are plenty of projects in other countries that account for this. Maybe it's just an issue of informing both sides to all the commission.
Okay, the answer to that is that I would welcome those who want to be involved and willing to commit their time to be members of the Advocacy Council, in which we discuss policy and we discuss the issues that really are pertinent to Miami Beach. There are examples not so far from here that we can look at for resiliency. The city has hired a company called AECOM. It's one of the leaders in resiliency in the city, in the country, and they are advising the city. It's unfortunate that the political will of the very vocal, I don't know if it's minority or majority, but there's a very vocal community out there looking to preserve at all cost. And that is something that we have to be able to combat with our voice.
And this might be a non-educated question, but it seems that a lot of what we're talking about is conservation seems to be the way to the future. Preservation is kind of something that people have a passion for and are holding on to. Could it be because of the families living in this place? What happens in that transition when we go conservation, and that changes the whole demographic of that area? Are these families that are going to be displaced for some significant period of time, are they going to be able to go back and buy homes and residencies in those areas?
If we build up. But
And
let
what do they do
Commissioner
in the
Allen
meantime?
Well, so let me answer that, because it's interesting. Someone made the argument of, we really need to preserve these older structures because that's the only way the current community is going to be able to stay there. This is our sort of lower middle income area, and that's the only way that those people have a place in our community. The price tag to build resiliency into a historic structure is greater than the price tag to build a new resilient structure. And I think Mr. Galvin will
That's
confirm that,
absolutely true.
So if anyone thinks that preservation is some sort of form of rent control, they're just dead wrong. It's actually gonna be more expensive. And so if the property owner or developer, does their calculation and says, well, if I preserve this and I spend all that money and I'm not going to have an end product that allows me to charge rents that are gonna pay a proper return on it, then I'm just not gonna do it. And that'll be decay. It won't be preservation, it'll just be decay. And to me, that's worse. The December 5th meeting, just so everyone has the right expectation about that, is really intended for city staff to inform the commission in order to make our decisions. So we'll have presentations by sustainability, by the preservation officer, by engineering, by public works, etc. I do believe there's going to be some scheduled public input. It is not going to be just a big public input session, because we had that already
Many
with the
times.
master planning process, which was months and months, but also at every other commission meeting and land use meeting that we've discussed this topic, we've had that public input already. So that I think is well exercised. I do believe that there are some things that the commissioners may not know, that, you know, in detail, what elevation are we talking about? Sometimes it's hard to see the written word, and so I think we're gonna see some more imagery that shows you, well, if my historic building that's 3 feet below base flood elevation is right next to an empty lot, and Jerry owns the empty lot, where is his finished floor gonna be compared to mine, and what does that mean, you know, and with the road? So we're hopefully gonna see some elevations that people can relate to. I do hope that there's some community input, but that it's organized, in that we're revealing the public input that we haven't heard yet. You know, for example, Reynaldo submitted a letter asking to speak and explained what he had to say, and to me it was something that I didn't feel that I had heard before, and so I did forward that. So if anyone would like to speak at that, feel free to email me at John Aleman, JOHNALEMAN at miamibeachfl.gov. You know,
I think
and
it'd be
make
great
your
if
case.
somebody from MAC would take the lead.
Other things that MAC and others can do prior to the December 5th meeting is email your commissioners. And if you want to just email it to me at the address that I gave you and ask me in your letter to forward it to all the commissioners, I'll forward it to the clerk, and the clerk will do that so that everybody gets it. That's one thing. The other thing is, regardless what happens on December the 5th, I would love to see some of the millennials get involved in some of these boards. You know, we've got the planning board, we've got the design review board, we've got the historic preservation board. Maybe some of you are architects or these are important boards. They have special requirements for the positions, but you can go online and you can see if you meet any of those criteria. I would love to see some of the younger folks get involved in these boards. It's generally pretty seasoned.
Also, one of the things that
Yvonne was
AKA
waiting
elder
very
folks.
patiently.
Yes, I have actually not a question, but a response to Commissioner Aleman's question that she gave to us. First of all, thanks for joining us today. And you brought up the question of, you know, there's not enough political will, and what do we do? And then you asked the question, you know, preservationist comes to me and they ask you the first question. Do we preserve or do we not preserve? And that's his job, to determine, yes, this is important and we should preserve. And you almost made it sound like as if from there, okay, we preserve, comes the next question. Who builds? How do I build? How do I design? You know, for contractors and architects, I'm sure, as we heard, the cost is much greater when you have to preserve. So they're happy to charge more bucks. So I don't think the question is, you know, do we preserve, do we not preserve, and then work our way down. I think these are all questions that have to be looked at together. So great that the preservationist says, okay, this is important, we need to preserve. That's his opinion. We also have to look at the opinions of the other professionals. You know, what is the cost? You know, is it gonna be too much to afford? Are these buildings, once they're designated, gonna just sit there because no investor's gonna wanna come in, buy it, and spend the extra bucks to renovate something that they have to keep? So are we gonna just like lose this little part of the city? It's, you know, no one's gonna end up
Well, the
investing.
answer is that yes.
28%.
The answer is yes, because I personally have restored over 20 buildings in North Beach, while my colleagues sitting around the table here have done more in South Beach, but I have in North Beach, and I can tell you that it already does not make economic sense anymore.
So that's
And therefore, I am advocating for this change. The city has looked at this, but the political will, again, of the resident has said, no, you're a greedy developer. Don't listen to his opinion.
There has to be other points that,
No. History is a great teacher. And Miami Beach is filled with history. if you can just Google and study the 1970s of Miami Beach to the 1980s of Miami Beach, you'll be amazed to see what happened in South Beach. In the 1970s, there was a moratorium placed in South Beach. A moratorium basically says that we're going to condemn your property. It's called the South Beach Redevelopment Plan. We're going to condemn your property, and any money that you put in after the moratorium date, you cannot be compensated for.
Which is now in North
So
Beach.
now, let me tell you what happened. So it's all historical. So the first few years, everybody thought we would develop and create a miniature Venice in South Beach. Nothing happened. Of course, nobody put money into any of those buildings because you couldn't be compensated for them. And then Brickell took off. Not Mary Village Brickell, but Brickell Avenue. So the money that was aimed at development for South Beach left. The developers found it easier to go to Brickell Avenue. So a whole 10 years went by with no renovation, no building, no investment in South Beach. Okay, so I'm almost done. Only in the 1980s, as a result of the Mariel refugee influx, where people were now able to make a decent living by putting 3 families in their dilapidated place, did landlords begin to make back some money. Now, when the city finally got around to redevelop and condemn South Beach to what it is today, it changed. It grew. So what you see here, eventually what will happen is that the code, these buildings, whether they be renovated, not renovated, whether it be economic sense or not economic sense, you'll stifle the community again, and for another 10 to 15 years. And we'll just kick the can down the road.
Ali, sorry, but we have 2 more millennial questions, and they only have 5 minutes, so let's take those questions and see if we can answer them.
Okay, one, Diego had a question.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. So really, we're talking about 2 issues in one. One would be on the federal side with the regulations on FEMA that's impacting the local businesses and families and homes. And then the second one is on the city level with December 5th, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So that being the case, in 2014, I worked with Congressman Michael Grimm up in New York when Sandy hit Staten Island and Brooklyn. Without the city help and the city councilmen, I guess the congressman wouldn't have been able to, work across the aisle, get, obviously the Insurance Affordable Care Act passed. However your political views are, that helped Staten Island. And that was with our federal elects, because on the city level, they're handcuffed. But what the city did do in New York was, build programs that they went in, they're raising homes now, and it's 3-4 years later.
Incentives.
Right, for incentives. So my question, I guess, to us and even, commissioners, what are we doing with our federal elects? Because the Rubios are not coming here. Governor Rick Scott will come and talk to Jerry, but he's not here. And I know why, but I think it's also on us. Part of this advocacy council is to reach out to them because, yeah, they're Republican and they may not want to get in, talk about climate change and all that. But at the end of the day, our local government is not going to help us with FEMA.
Well, first of all, our local government has a lot of power to help us.
Right.
Because while we have to follow the guidelines of the federal government, we locally, like they did in Staten Island, like they did after Sandy, they realized that FEMA is not going to come in and start paying.
Right.
So what they did is they loosened the building code and allowed for people to build. And they created an incentive for people to build something more economical. The same thing could happen here as well. Now, if you force a property through preservation to be not to be moved, like Albie mentioned for one reason, or what Ronaldo mentioned for another reason, and what Wayne mentioned for all rational reasons why somebody will not make that investment, the local government can incentivize the property owners to actually revitalize. By how? By increasing the building rights, by saying, wait a second, we're gonna give you credits for this, or we're going to bring in affordable housing within your properties, and we'll give you more building rights. So it's really equality of housing and resiliency and sustainability are part of the same formula. It's not three separate issues. Now, regarding dealing with our state and federal government, we have made many efforts to bring them to have this conversation, not about climate change, about how do you deal with the flooding. And they have not been very receptive, to say the least. And I know that the
I
commissioners.
just bring that up because, you
Yeah.
know, it's a crucial time, it's a crucial time in this country. We're about to go through a major transition that unfortunately our federal congressman that represents Miami Beach is not really gonna get anything done, you know, with the Trump administration. And it's something to be concerned about, I think, because without these federal reps on our side, or at least entertaining our conversations, you know, what do we really accomplish?
Well, we
you
have a
know?
lot to accomplish, and we have a lot, we can regulate locally to resolve our own issues. We cannot change the federal government, maybe not in the short term, but we can definitely regulate locally to adapt and to incentivize to push those things along.
Sarah, who's your last question?
All right, last question. Sea level rise aside, why does smart development in North Beach make more sense for the community for real estate, affordability purposes, and what other purposes?
Well, smart development, well, North Beach has not benefited from the development boom that we saw in Miami Beach throughout its history, except for in the 50s. In the 1950s, they were building barrack houses, row buildings, and they were trying to take advantage of the vacation rental. Almost every single building in North Beach has a postcard, come to Miami Beach, stay for $60 a week. These properties are were not necessarily built for residents and families and young people. They were built for vacation rentals. And in order to entice whether it's a micro unit or a family unit. If it's a family unit, you want it to be 1,500 to 1,800 square feet on one level. If it's a micro unit, you need to have a gym, a pool, and a Starbucks around the corner. So either way, it doesn't meet the criteria of what the market needs. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
I just want to say one thing before you guys got to go, and that, you know,
And then Ronaldo
Commissioner-
wants to say something.
Commissioner Alleman, you know, made the salient point about the power of the preservation community and how they throw around their power. I mean, they have it, they flaunt it. You know, we're not going to support you in your reelection unless you do this or do that. And you know, the millennials, this community is in your hands in the future. And I'm actually impressed that there are 8 of you here today and 15 online.
There's 18.
18 online and 8 here. There's 26 of you represented in just this little meeting that you pulled together in the last few days. You know, looking down the road, maybe it's not for December 5th, and maybe you're not going to influence this particular decision on December 5th, but I believe that you guys can organize to become a force to be reckoned with on many issues, this one included, but many issues. And that's really what the Millennial Action Council was about, to be able to take positions and take action, to have your voices be heard, and the elected officials will respond to you as a group on many issues, because you do represent an awesome power. You represent the future.
That I don't know of any other voice, so I think it's incredibly unique and could be amazingly powerful, and really welcome, at least by me, to hear your voice and to know what you are looking for out of your commission in terms of leadership that's going to create the Miami Beach that you want to continue to live in, to raise your families in, 20 years from now or whenever it is. I think that's really crucial.
Live, work, play.
And you can have an influence on the December 5th meeting. You absolutely can. All the commissioners are human too, and are all very intelligent, educated, experienced people that really love Miami Beach. Whether I agree with any one of them or not, I respect them, and they care about the city, and they're really doing their best. So recognizing that,
you know, as you get new information, you should always afford yourself room to change your mind, you know, based on that new information. And so I see that window with my colleagues, and I would really encourage you. It does matter when we get calls, when we get emails, telling us how you see something and what you want us to do, and be clear. I find it incredibly helpful, and I know my colleagues do too. And we you know, we'll reference those communications when we're discussing with each other about our justification for how we made up our mind. Right.
All right, Ronaldo.
Yeah,
Wait,
so-
he's gonna close out,
Yeah,
and then
so
I gotta go.
there was a great concern there about look and feel, and the fact that we don't want North Beach to look like Brickell. We don't want it to look like Edgewater. I mean, the character and the nature and the look and feel and spirit of this community should evolve into something that is fantastic. I mean, this could be a real green example of, you know, using solar, making sure that we're bringing resiliency into everything that we do, making sure that we're really reinvesting into the future of the city. To me, this is not an attack on preservation, it's really an attack on our senses to make sure that we are making the right intelligent decisions for North Beach. It's a great opportunity to really reinvent. Really, renovation in a coastal city needs to be redefined. Renovation in this age of climate change and sea level rise, historic preservation needs to be thought of now as reinventing our cities to make sure that there is a city here. This is really about preserving Miami Beach from an economic viability point of view. Miami Beach will not be viable if we don't bring new value, new assets within sensible scales, within sensible FARs. This is not about doubling the height or, you know, tripling the FAR. This is really about sensible development, and the Conservation District allows us to regulate it, to balance it. The Design Review Board will still be involved in approving every single building that gets approved and permitted in this area, but it will not sort of be in the historic preservation sense where we are concerned that that will really create lack of growth, lack of redevelopment, lack of reinvestment. Everything that the community desperately needs. Miami Beach needs to look at a new future of redevelopment, and that formula has changed. And if you look at redevelopment concepts throughout coastal cities, throughout the country, throughout the world, everybody's thinking through this with great concern, and I think we should be. And I also like to say that I hope that this incredible commissioner that is sort of leading through here without being concerned about re-election, that we can multiply that with the rest of our friends in the commission, because everybody is a human being and everybody is thinking through this with their own sense and with their own sensibility. But this by far is not an attack on preservation. It's really trying to think through this in a way that integrates the landowners and the developers, the stakeholders, the ones that are really at risk in these communities financially, you know, to help us think through this challenge.
In a way, it's really, we all are in favor of preservation. It's, do you preserve through the hammer of preservation, which prevents actually saving these buildings in the long run, or do you create these, you know, rules and guidelines that allow for sensible development that will actually protect and preserve these buildings a little bit longer? Eventually, the water's going to win.
Let's.
Well, the design and
We're
the spirit
right
of
now.
it.
We're ready to close up the meeting.
Yeah.
So I want to first of all say that there are 9 significant properties identified in North Beach that I have proposed to the commission on many occasions to spend their time figuring out how to preserve those specific properties through redevelopment of the other areas of the neighborhood. But I want to concentrate. I think we had a long and fruitful discussion. I first want to thank Commissioner Alaman, who took from her busy schedule, which we do know that is very busy, to participate in the whole conversation and not just come here for to make a statement, which is very helpful to be part of that conversation. And I want to urge I don't like the name, the Millennial Group, I'll call it the MAC from now on. The MAC group for participating, and I want to urge you all to reach out and to continuously be active in finding out more about this issue. We have a rich community of knowledge, whether it's the attorneys here, the architects that we have here, leaders in Miami Beach, and all would be very happy to further educate you and bring you into the fold of how to be more active in this organization and in the city of Miami Beach. So thank you very much.
And I want to specifically thank Sari and
yes.
Jamie
Yes.
as the two chairs of the council, and Danny Diaz from our staff, and all of you that took time, all of the millennials that took time to come today and that
Max.
participated online.
Max.
All the
And
Max.
we're also going to be doing a follow-up via social media and email with action items for how we can help. And also, we want to get all the names. If you can email me, and we'll blast it out
For all the
to
commissioners'
everyone
names.
of all the commissioners, because we're gonna send emails. So thank you
We'll do it.
guys.
Thank
We'll do
you.
it. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
sir.